So there's plenty more to discuss here. So let's bring in our panel to talk about the party's climate change promises and if they go far enough. So let's introduce them now. Catherine Harrison is a professor of political science specializing in environmental policy at UBC in Vancouver. John Hogan is the Deputy Chief of Lytton First Nation in Kamloops, BC. And Sarah Larniuk is a freelance climate change reporter in Winnipeg. Thank you to all of you for joining us tonight. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so Catherine, I will start with you. Now, the main three political parties, as we just explained, have released a lot of their climate policies. Which of the platforms do you think is the most realistic?
It depends what you mean by realistic. I think the targets are something to start with. Canada has already submitted the new target of a 40 to 45% reduction to the United Nations, and the Paris Agreement does not allow a country to go back to a previous target or to weaken a target. So that would mean that a Conservative government would go to COP26, the international negotiations in Glasgow, and acknowledge to the world that Canada is not committed to complying with its target in the treaty. The question then is, can the other parties meet their more ambitious targets? I think both the Liberal and NDP plans are considerably more ambitious than the Conservatives. It's encouraging that they both rely on carbon pricing and regulation rather than just promising to throw money at voters, which we know doesn't work that well. And, you know, there's some trade-offs between them, but they both make a big step forward since 2019.
And now, Sarah, I wanted to ask you, in terms of taking a look at all of the climate policies that have been put forward up to day 16 in this election campaign trail so far, which proposal stood out to you or maybe surprised you?
Well, the cap on oil and gas emissions put forward by the Liberals and NDP, and as well as introducing this idea of 5-year incremental goals that industry must make, that is new. And that is good to see, because in Canada, that's where we've seen the lion's share of our emissions increase is in the oil and gas sector. And so while we have had a lot of oil and gas companies commit to net zero targets, the plans that they've put forward haven't really had any material that would get them there. It's based on technology that's not commercially viable at this point or doesn't exist at all. And so having the incremental plans is a big step forward on reining in emissions from that sector. And additionally, the put forward a 75% decrease in methane emissions. So that's also a huge advance.
All right, so John, of course, I want to go to you and bring you into this conversation, because no one knows perhaps the impact of climate change more than someone from Lytton, BC. We know that this summer, Lytton completely burned. And when you look then at the policies that have been put forth so far by all of the parties, and listening also to what Sarah and Catherine had to say, what do you think stands out, or do you think some of these policies are going far enough?
Well, I am calling in from Chuquapamagulu, and I am in Tlakapaman. As far as going far enough, I don't think they do, because the Liberal platform is the only one that mentions salmon. And salmon is a keystone species for our Indigenous people in BC. And as you mentioned, I live at the capital of my nation, which is Lytton, and it was totally destroyed by that catastrophic fire on June the 30th. So yes, I do know the full-blown impact of climate change, and the heat dome that we endured for those 3 days in June were just devastating.
And so in terms of what you'd like to see more of, I know you touched on that, but maybe if you can give us some more specifics, what do you think your community or Indigenous communities in general would like to see more being spoken about on the campaign trail by these federal leaders? And we know that it is such an important voter issue. I believe the Angus Reid poll said 1 in 5. It was one of the top 5 issues for them when it comes to voting.
Well, I'd like to see them concentrate more on the water and the salmon. And you could tell with these three parties that the three main parties, there's a lot more to be said around salmon, and with high water temperatures, that has a devastating effect on salmon, whether they're migrating through to get to their spawning grounds or they're sitting in the river waiting to move because of warm water conditions. I know in my province, industry and the economy has taken a lot from salmon via the Nechako River. They put that system into Rio Tinto, Alcan, and Kitimat for that economic driver of the aluminum smelter. And that water was taken away from the salmon. So it has devastating effects on the upper White River sturgeon in the Nechako system, and it has impacts on the early Stuart sockeye run, which our people have not benefited from participating in that fishery for over 30 years. So those are some of the real impacts to salmon in British Columbia as we know it today.
And, you know, I want to just clarify the exact number here. The Angus Reid poll that came out said that 1 in 5 Canadians say climate change is their top election issue. So to that point, Catherine, it's not just about policies in Canada. How much do you believe Canadian voters also want to see what role Canada plays globally when it comes to tackling climate change?
Canadians want to do their part internationally. I think it's important to Canadians that we fulfill an international treaty obligation and also that we don't embarrass ourselves on the world stage. For decades at the international negotiations, Canada would win the Fossil of the Day award from environmental groups regularly. And I think things have significantly changed in the last few years, and there's an opportunity with these new targets, with the commitment to carbon pricing, with capping emissions from the oil industry for Canada to speak with more credibility than we have been able to for 30 years.
And Sarah, to your point in regards to one of the things that stood out for you, what do you think is missing?
I mean, to John's point, I mean, what I haven't seen addressed is adaptation. There's a lot of talk about emissions reduction, which is obviously critical, but if this summer demonstrated anything, it's that we are already living in a changed climate, and salmon are far from the only species that are suffering. Caribou, we are in a biodiversity crisis, and so the people who are principally feeling that impact are First Nations and Northern residents. And so to hear nothing or next to nothing about how we are going to adapt what the party's plans are is really disappointing, especially in a year where we've seen unprecedented drought, heat waves, and fires.
Well, some really important perspectives that you three have managed to bring to our viewers today. Thank you so much for your time. That is Catherine Harrison, and she is a professor of political science. John Hogan is the Deputy Chief of Lytton First Nation in Kamloops, BC. And Sarah Larniuk is a freelance climate change reporter in Winnipeg. Thank you to all three of you.
Wish we could say more.